Good afternoon, everybody. I am Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and welcome to this Brennan Center for Justice event. We are a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen the systems of democracy and justice in the United States. And I will be your moderator for this afternoon. And we are so grateful for our partners in producing today's event. ProPublica is an independent nonprofit newsroom that produces investigative journalism that shines a light on abuses of power and betrayals of public trust, and that holds the powerful to account, and welcome to them. NYU's John Brademas Center advocates for civil debate on politics and public policy, and NYU Votes, which strives to give every eligible NYU student the tools to participate in our democracy, the resources they need to register and cast their ballot. Please visit nyu.edu/NYU-votes. It's now 53 days away from this extraordinary election. Extraordinary in how important it is for the country, extraordinary in the circumstances under which it is being held. A global pandemic, civil unrest, deep recession, and extraordinary and in many ways divisive political goings on, also of a kind that we perhaps haven't seen in a long time, if ever. We have every reason to expect massive participation. In 2014, the United States had the lowest voter turnout in 72 years. That was a sign really of a kind of a disconnection of a weakness in our democracy. But in 2018, we had the highest voter turnout in over a century. There's been a real reconnection, a real civic engagement, even before some of the recent things that have happened in the world. And there's every reason to expect massive public desire to participate in this election. But because of all these variables, the way the election is going to be held and the way the news media will cover and shape perceptions of how that election will be held will be different and will be extraordinarily important. There's a lot at stake, and news organizations have to find a way to work to ensure that there's fair and accurate and comprehensive reporting. So the question we want to ask these extraordinarily talented journalists who are with us today is, what can journalists do writ large to prepare the public for this election, to prepare for the possibility that it may not be an election night, but an election season, and how to understand and how to process the many different things that voters will have to understand sometimes for the first time. We are thrilled to be joined by some of the country's most articulate experts on these issues who can help us think through these issues. First of all, Steve Engelberg, who is the editor-in-chief at ProPublica, Abby Phillip, who is a political correspondent at CNN, who is covering this extraordinary 2020 presidential election, and Amy Walter, the national editor for the Cook Political Report, a regular PBS NewsHour commentator and host of The Takeaway, Politics with Amy Walter. Before we jump in, and I get to have the privilege of asking all the questions on my mind, I want to invite all of you who are listening to share your questions for the panel by typing them into the question and answer box, the Q&A box. God bless Zoom, and let us know where you're watching from. After we've had a chance to talk through some of these issues, we will take as many of these questions as we can. And so the first question that I have for the panelists really is, I'm not the youngest child here, I'm probably, or perhaps the oldest child, but I will paraphrase from the Seder at my house. Why is this election night different from all other election nights? What, as you look at it, makes it stand out, and what makes it so different? And Amy, you're on my screen, so why don't you give it a start?
Well put. Michael, even before we were in this extraordinary time, as you pointed out, between unrest, a pandemic, an economic recession, I think there was also a lot of folks looking to 2020 as being a very different election because of what happened in 2016. and the sort of reckoning and that came in news organizations about the ways in which they led up to the campaign and how election night went, and not wanting to make some of those same assumptions and same mistakes. And I think what that meant was there was going to be less focus on getting a narrative out early and much more about watching as individual states and districts and et cetera came in on election night. I think what has changed, of course, is not just those issues, but the fact that the president himself has injected his own opinions about voting and voting by mail that makes it even harder to have the sort of objective conversations we normally would be having about voting and how voting works. And it's turned into a much more partisan discussion. We know now that when we're looking in polling that if you are a Democrat, you are right now saying you're much more likely to vote by mail than if you're a Republican. That has an impact not just on what the election turnout is going to look like, but also in the ways in which voters are going to believe the results that we get. And if I think about the way that I'm going to approach election night, in some ways it's the same, right? We're looking at many of the same states, waiting for the votes to come in from those states to give us a sense of who the next president will be, who's going to control Congress. But I think we are already, most of the news organizations that I speak with are already deeply into reporting to and telling their viewers, their audience, that this may not be just one night, that this is an election that is likely to drag on beyond the early morning hours of Wednesday, that given the interest in voting by mail and the challenge, especially in some of these states that don't traditionally vote by mail in the Midwest, Pennsylvania is the one I think about a lot, or Wisconsin. If those states are really, really close, it's just going to take us some time to count those ballots. And so I think there is going to be much more caution from all of us on election night about, as we watch the early numbers coming in, about making too many assumptions about what this is going to mean.
And that would make it a very different election night from what we've become accustomed to of the breathless reveal at 11 o'clock East Coast time when the West Coast polls close and it's finally possible to tell the public what the answer is, and almost a throwback to the way it used to be, where even in elections that were not particularly close, it would take a day or two, even in the television era, to conclude who won. Abby, Phillip, you are with your colleagues preparing for this very election night. How do you envision your own coverage, and how do you see this as different from what we might be used to?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is just going to be a really big exercise in patience for everyone, from voters to reporters. It's to viewers, I mean, I think that I work at CNN. People come to CNN to hear Wolf Blitzer call the election at the end of the night. And we're going to be cautious like everybody else, because we understand that the universe of votes is going to be potentially much larger than we're used to. It's also going to be coming in a lot more forms than we're used to. So I think the poll today out from the Washington Post said 60%, or 6 in 10 voters say they're going to try to vote early if they can at all. So, we're talking early voting in person, we're talking mail-in voting, absentee voting, and then in all 50 states, we've got different versions of how quickly those ballots are going to be counted. So some states might try to count them before Election Day. Some states can't start until Election Day. Some states can't start until polls close on Election Day. So we have a potpourri of potential issues here, and I think we just need to take it state by state by state. The good news is, however, we don't necessarily need to know what the margin is in every single state, but to Amy's point, it's going to be the game of the big battlegrounds. I mean, maybe the big battlegrounds are Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Florida. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's Nevada. Maybe it's Minnesota. Maybe it's Ohio. I mean, I think we are in a position right now where I like to say we're in the middle of this political realignment in terms of how people in terms of who the electorate is, where they are, and who is movable in the electorate. And as a result, I think it actually makes this election night process even more difficult because we're not totally sure where the battlegrounds are. We think we know based on 2016, but we're not totally sure. And then the one only other thing to your original question about what makes this different, I personally think that the biggest fundamental difference between this year and previous years is not necessarily that we're not going to know on election night. It is that we have a candidate, a president, who is for months ahead of the election already saying that he is maybe going to contest it and maybe not going to accept the results depending on how it goes. I mean, we've had close elections before. We've had 2000, we've had 2004, but I don't believe that in those past elections, we've had the candidates themselves saying, well, you know, we really can't trust the results. You know, all these ballots are fraudulent before they're even cast. That is going to be the big difference. Resisting that on the media's part is a big task. But I mean, frankly, I think we're all on the same page in terms of the mainstream media, so to speak. We know that these ballots are not fraudulent. We just need to remind our audience of that and push back on efforts on either side to call this election before we know where the ballots really are.
Thank you. And the extraordinary factor of President Trump overtly working to undermine confidence in the election before it's held. We've had elections during pandemics in 1918. We've had during wars and civil war. We've never had a political leader, let alone a candidate, let alone a president doing that. And I know we're going to have more to talk about on that. And I have a bunch of questions I have. Steve Engelberg of ProPublica, from your perspective, what is different? What are you all thinking about? What should the media be thinking about? And how does this play out in local news, who I know you partner with on many of these things?
Well, first of all, we're very lucky in one sense. Abby and Amy will have to make sense in real time. And ProPublica, nobody comes to ProPublica to see who won the election, and we're not set up to do that. And thank goodness we're not trying to, because I think that's an extremely, as has been described, a very difficult thing. What we do have is an ongoing project called Election Land, in which we partnered with a number of dozens and dozens of local news organizations. And what we've been trying the last couple of rounds of this is to cover elections in real time, to gather on the internet and publish reports of what is happening at the polls. Interestingly enough, I would say, you know, in 2016, that exercise was relatively boring. We had, you know, scattered reports of intimidation here, ballot machines broken there, long lines in some places, and we reported on them, and sometimes they were even fixed in real time. I think there is a very real possibility in this election that we'll see something we've never seen before, which is people coming to the polls or coming to polling places and trying to intimidate voters. So let's start with that as a big difference. You know, in all the elections I've seen, and you said you were the oldest, I'm not sure. I think I'm the oldest. I was working at the New York Times, you know, in 2020, I'm sorry, in the year 2000, on the investigative desk. So therefore, one of the only lonely people not called in on election night. I was sitting on my couch and I fell asleep about midnight and woke up at 4 a.m. to a different result. Or a seemingly different result. And suddenly it was an investigative story. And I was in the office very early the next day running the investigative coverage of that election. And, you know, I think this is a very, very different moment. You know, you go back to some people may remember this, there was a moment where they were trying to count votes in Florida. And there was a sort of organized mob of khaki-clad you know, Republican operatives who charged into the building to disrupt the count, the so-called khaki riot. Well, if we have a khaki riot this time around, it's going to involve firearms, or at least it certainly could. And so these are things we're trying to think about, which is to say we're thinking the unthinkable. Our Election Land project will be up and running. By the way, if there are any local journalists on the call who don't know about it, please go to ProPublica.org and check in with us, because we'd love to have you. And we will be trying again to do this in real time. But frankly, I think, you know, the things we're worried about are things we've never thought about on election day before. And so Like the rest of the panelists, I'm sitting here trying to calibrate my expectations and think through how on earth we could cover the unthinkable, which I think is eminently possible.
And you're mentioning that scene at the county counting board in Florida that was also called the Brooks Brothers riot.
Yes.
Compare that with the Michigan militia storming the State House a few months ago, disrupting the legislature as it legislated on pandemic response. In one ways, this will be one could look at this as the first really closely contested election under DC versus Heller, with open carry of firearms and such a profusion of firearms that we see in the country right now, and all of which poses a lot of challenges, I think, especially for a broadcast which is of necessity showing people what's going on in real time. And I want to go back to what several of you mentioned, which is the phenomenon of vote by mail, how those ballots, when they're counted and how they're treated. It's striking. There's this partisan divide of who votes by mail and who's going to vote in person. Of course, as we know, that's never been the way it's broken out previously. And it wasn't even what the polls showed a few months ago before President Trump started railing against vote by mail. How should journalists, how should the media cover this without falling into, I will posit, the trap of even implicitly treating the mailed-in votes as somehow different from the vote-in-person votes? We can expect possibly that there'll be half the votes, and this could change, but half the votes cast in person and the other half coming in by mail, and in some places still being counted. Thinking about the public and its expectations, how can journalists teach people to understand this without preaching at them what they need to do?
It's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I think this is an ongoing process. It's been going on for several months. I've been doing a lot of our vote by mail reporting for months now. Before, I never imagined when I started reporting on this that this is really where we would be in terms of how entrenched the partisanship would become on this. And I think that people are learning about the process, but from their usual camp. So if you're a Republican, you're probably hearing a lot from the president about absentee versus mail-in voting, which we know are not substantively different really in any way. And then there are, I think that as I report this, there are a couple of two universes of issues. One is that there are real concerns about how mail-in ballots are handled and whether people's votes are handled properly and whether they count when they should count. And those concerns need to be addressed, and there needs to be sort of attention being brought to them so that lawmakers who in some states seem that they haven't really ever thought about this in decades because, their universe of mail-in voters was a couple of thousand and now it's going to be a couple of million, they need to start thinking about these things early. So those are like real things that really need to be discussed. And then there's a universe of concerns about the prospect for fraud that I think that we need to be clear-eyed about how realistic those prospects are. And I do think that we know, based on the places that have done this for a long time, that there is not a significant amount of fraud in this country, even if you counted a couple of hundred. In terms of the ballots that are cast nationwide, it is not in any way significant. And now we have Ben Ginsburg, a premier Republican election lawyer, saying so on the record and being very clear that this is something that he thinks his party needs to kind of let go of. So I think that we need to be clear about what legitimate questions are about processes and really the people's ballots need to count. I mean, I think that is the most important thing, is sort of, there are all these ways in which people's ballots might not count. And the public needs to be aware of that so they can exert pressure on their elected officials to think about these things, in some cases for the first time. But on the other hand, I think reporters need to be very clear-eyed about what is a legitimate concern for fraud. There are a lot of claims of fraud that are effectively, well, it's possible that this might open the door to something that could potentially happen once or twice. And those types of concerns, I think we can say, based on the information that we have, do not rise to any sort of standard of widespread fraud. And I think we should be very clear as reporters about informing the public about that, because a lot of people are very confused, and they're also very worried that their votes are not going to count.
And you know, as you know, the Brennan Center over many years has studied this question of voter fraud and how widespread is it. And our conclusion, and it's been backed up over by courts and others, is that you're more likely to be struck by lightning in the United States as a statistical matter than to commit voter fraud. But how can journalists, how can the media treat this not as a claim, say, by President Trump or anybody else, but as a lie? In other words, some things are in the nature of, you know, politics has different points of view and there's different views about things, and other things are just facts and they're not true, like how many people were on the mall during the inauguration or something like that. How does one convey the facts about voter fraud or its non-existence, while simultaneously, as you say, not glossing over the challenge and the problems of converting to vote by mail in a lot of states that have never done it before? You know, Wisconsin, 1 out of 4 Americans in 2016 voted by mail, but they were principally people in states like California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Utah, that have done this before. In Wisconsin, during the primary, which was in the middle of the worst beginnings of the pandemic, they went from 250,000 people who typically would vote by mail in a primary to 1.4 million in a week. And the system just buckled. They didn't change the law, they just weren't able to handle it. So given the reality of the possibility of just issues with when votes get counted and how they get counted, how does one disentangle those things so that it doesn't all make viewers or voters scared or deterred from participating? Amy?
Yeah, well, you know, we're doing something on my show, on The Takeaway, this week in North Carolina. And next week, we're checking in with Arizona, and then we're checking in with Pennsylvania, and speaking with secretaries of state and those who are in charge of elections. In North Carolina, it's a board of elections. And look, I think every local reporter is probably already doing this, but I think getting the people in your state as much information as possible and working with the Secretary of State to get that information out constantly about what absentee voting, in-person voting, vote by mail, vote early look like. And what you'll find is, at least in my experience, and I think, you know, Abby's been on this beat for a long time too, these secretaries of state know exactly the challenge ahead of them. They are not naive to this. Some of them have been, as you pointed out, like in Wisconsin, they knew this was going to be a challenge. There were some things they expected to go wrong that did go wrong. There were some unexpected challenges, but they've done after action reports. The same thing happened in Georgia. So they're addressing a lot of the shortcomings that they had in the primaries. Now, some of it can't get fixed by November. Some of it's going to just cost way too much money and investment that they don't have in the infrastructure of counting ballots. But for the most part, every one of these states, especially these battleground states, know what's ahead of them. It's educating voters on what to expect and how to do this voting. And I think, you know, in a place like North Carolina, for example, where you're seeing a record number of absentee applications, I think the most important thing to educate voters about is how to actually fill them out. As a kid, I will admit to this, almost every single one of my report cards started with, you know, it'd be great if Amy actually didn't try to rush through everything and read the entire list of instructions or how to finish this project before she dove into it. So I am very much guilty of just getting something in front of me, filling it out, and not paying much attention. North Carolina, you need a witness signature on your ballot. Now, it used to be 2, now it's 1, but you need to get that, and you need to sign your own ballot in the correct place. If you do that incorrectly, if you get it in time, they will tell you this: hey, listen, your ballot, we can't use it. Here's your opportunity. We can send you another ballot. You can vote in person, et cetera. But if you send it in late, it will be spoiled and you're not going to be able to, your vote won't be counted. So helping people understand what they need to do, and you as a voter need to also follow through on instructions. Another thing I think will be very important for the states to do, and I think Pennsylvania has been doing a fantastic job. I know the Philadelphia Inquirer in particular has been doing really great work on this, helping people understand, make the process really transparent, especially for how votes are going to be released on election day. It is likely that cities like Philadelphia and the suburbs surrounding Philadelphia are going to have a lot more mail ballots than others, and it's going to take them longer to process them than the rest of the state. So it is possible on election night, and I know that the CNNs of the world are going to be doing the same thing, but to say, look, a lot of vote has come in right now. It's going to show Donald Trump likely ahead. That does not necessarily mean he's going to win, doesn't mean he's going to lose either. But we are still waiting on big chunks of vote to come in. So how the national news organizations release this information is going to be important. But for people who live in those states, I think having the local news organizations walk through the process and have it done with election officials to be as transparent as possible is going to be the best solution.
And that kind of news you can use, that kind of public education to people of having to do something, either vote by mail, or maybe there's consolidation of polling places because of lack of poll workers. All these things, many people are going to have to vote differently than they used to. That really is going to ultimately have to be a function for local news. And I do have a question, Steve Engelberg. I look at the website of the late lamented, or not quite late lamented, but all that's left is the website Newseum. And they have the wonderful Today's Front Pages, which shows you what local newspapers are running all over the country. And I realize newspapers are not the only way people get their information, of course, but you wouldn't know there was an election going on if you look at the front pages of most papers in the United States. How can local news play its very particular role on something like this?
Well, it's funny. I was thinking about exactly that question as you were talking, because I spent 5 years as the managing editor of the Oregonian, one of several managing editors. And Oregon does vote entirely by mail. It's a very strange process to an East Coaster. I insisted actually every first Tuesday of driving to the collection box and dropping my ballot so I could feel I voted. But that's not how most people do it in Oregon. They mail them in. And here's what we knew in Oregon. We knew, because we've been voting by mail there for many, many years, that at 8:05, the state election people would release the first tranche of votes. And one of the old timers there, I said, so what happens then? He says, well, the second tranche comes in and it's never more than 1% different from the first tranche. And we know that because this is just the way it is. And it's always been this way. So we knew exactly what was going to happen. And the old timer was right. I was there, for a couple of election cycles, and it went hit there, the way John Harvey said, every time. We don't have that data for these states that are about to do this. So for Abby and Amy, who might have, all this sort of historical data on bellwether precincts and what to expect. And, we know in East Texas, if it's this, and then we need to have a certain percent in West Texas. Every single model that has ever existed that would help you understand what's happening has now completely been blown up. And you don't have John Harvey at the Oregonian reassuring you, saying, I've seen 20 of these, this is how it's going to go in the mail count. So I do think the education of people about what we know and what we don't know is really going to be very important. Having said that, I don't want to be kind of a downer here. I think there is a percentage of our fellow Americans who will listen to this stuff wherever they find it. And there is a percentage, frankly, on both sides of the divide, who no matter what we say, they're not going to believe us. And that's tough. I mean, there are people who live in a universe of alternate facts. You said, well, it's a fact who went to the inauguration. I believe that's where the alternate facts came from. And I believe that it was Kellyanne Conway who said, Sean Spicer was putting out alternate facts that other people would like to believe. And so there is going to be a universe where mail order balloting is automatically fraudulent. And, you know, when Philadelphia comes pouring in at an 18 or 19 to 1 rate of Democratic votes, and suddenly the state flips from red to blue on CNN, there are people who are going to say that's all fake. And I don't know how we persuade them. But that having been said, we can certainly, and I'm sure the Inquirer is doing this, and you can certainly in other states do, look, historically, this is how the state stacks. If mail order balloting is like the way it's been, these are the bellwether precincts. We may not know that for a couple of days. I mean, I will say, no one's mentioned this, but does anyone remember the Iowa caucuses? I mean, man, if we do a national election like that, it's going to be bad. I don't know. Abby, Amy, what do you think?
Yeah, I remember it vividly. And I mean, that's a good example of how not to do. I think the problem with the Iowa caucuses was that they didn't know that this delay would happen. And so they couldn't prepare people ahead of time. And so we were all expecting at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock to get some results in, and we got nothing. So I think we will be in a better position on some level on this election night, because we're all sitting here talking about it. We know that there are going to be some delays, but the tricky thing is that it is so nuanced state by state. I cannot emphasize this enough. The state by state nature of this, and also the fact that some of these deadlines and procedures and rules are going to be changing up until election day because of ongoing litigation. It is going to be a very confusing landscape. And so it requires a lot of patience for people not to get in over their skis. And I think we also saw, you know, the social media companies are starting to think about this too. Facebook announcing a couple of days ago that they are going to kind of buy into some of the election night data that the news organizations have in an effort to actually to push back against preemptive calls. And I think that is probably a healthy thing for Facebook and Twitter or whoever else, responsible actors in the social media world, because that's going to be the kind of thing that really causes chaos when you have, you know, it doesn't have to be the candidates themselves. It could be key surrogates out there trying to call the election when we can't do that yet.
But what you know, Abby, that's such a great point. And what I really worry about is all the video that's going to get uploaded for these next few months, but certainly as we get into election day, of long lines at polling places, people putting up videos that show, you know, folks banging on the window, let us in, right? Polls are closing down illegally, our votes aren't being counted. People taking videos of their local post office and accusing the post office of dumping ballots in the trash. I saw it. I've put my camera here in the back of this postal delivery system that is clearly throwing out ballots from this neighborhood. And I just don't see how Facebook or Twitter or anybody else can really regulate that. And so on top of all the information that we're giving, folks are going to be logging onto their Facebook feed and seeing all these videos that their friends are going to share with them. And it's going to just lead to even more confusion. And that's what worries me really the most.
Well, you know, in the print journalism world, which I grew up in, we had this very quaint tradition that said, you know, if somebody was going to, you know, some Oppo research was going to release, you know, an election moving story, let's say the night before the election, you wouldn't publish that because the other candidate would have no chance to answer. And that was a very nice and quaint tradition. You know, what I learned when I was in Oregon, which is now going to be true for the whole country, is if you believe that, then election day is going to start about 5 weeks out. And that is not going to be possible. And then even if you wanted to be, you know, like that and say, well, we're just not going to put these irresponsible things on the eve of an election, somebody will. And so I think, you know, that's a different world.
And in France, where they don't have a First Amendment, they have a law, I believe, or at least a practice that they won't cover the election for the day before. So when Russia tried to dump false information about Macron right before the election, it just literally didn't get covered. And thus it didn't have the impact that the people who put it out there were attempting to. How does everything that everybody has described play into the actual mechanics, planning for production of the quadrennial ritual of election night. Will it be election night? Should the networks just say we're done at 11 and we'll be back tomorrow for the continuing of the counting? Will there be, and we've gotten a number of questions from the listeners, will the networks or journalists be in a position to make a commitment from making calls? Will there be maps with, red and blue states? How are people who are thinking about this a lot planning for it?
Well, I don't know too much about this because that's a little bit above my pay grade here at CNN. There are a lot of people, and when I say a lot of people, I mean a lot of people who spend their days and nights these days thinking about these very issues. And so it's being thought through constantly and worked through how we can illustrate to people what we know and what we don't know. What is the universe of the in-person vote? What is the universe of the mail-in vote? How much do we know has already come in? How much do we know is still maybe in transit in the states where it can be in transit for a day or two after the election? So that is all being worked through. But I mean, I will say, I mean, we're a 24-hour news outlet, and I've been involved in, election nights at CNN all through the night, whether it's a close election or not. So, we are primed for that kind of thing. I remember in election night 2016, I was in Hillary Clinton's headquarters that night. I left that night. She conceded well into, the early morning hours. And then I was back on CNN at 5 a.m. a few hours later. So, I mean, this is what we do. I don't think that we will keep people, I think I can say this, we will keep people updated for as long as we need to keep them updated, even if it means our election night effectively is multiple days and multiple nights. I mean, people are going to want to know every second that ballots come in, and we will let them know because if we have the ability to do it, we'll give them the information in as close to real time as possible.
Yeah, Abby, I don't know that I've ever left election night before like 3 a.m.
Right.
That would be just a miracle. So you very rarely get, I mean, there are some elections that are, 2008 was probably the last time, and 2008 and 2012 sort of spoiled us because it was so clean and clear early on in the night. But 2000, obviously, as you noted, Michael, there was that infamous, we're taking the call back. And of course, 2016, we couldn't know for sure until much later, certainly much past the 11 p.m. hour.
Well, the additional factor, of course, different from all those elections, is the expectation that we have that President Trump, at the very least, or his supporters, will fill the empty space with claims of victory, claims of fraud, screaming. He has already said the election is rigged. He's already said that it's the most corrupt election in American history. I like to think that somewhere up there, Richard Nixon is watching and being very frustrated that Trump is claiming that mantle for now. But how to factor in, while being fair, this extraordinary new fact of the very large chunk of the electorate who are going to be not just primed to believe, but encouraged to believe that there's something amiss if it takes longer to count the votes.
Well, and let me just add, because we were doing a brainstorming on this recently, and my social media person dug up the president's tweet from the Florida gubernatorial election, in which the president of the United States actually said on election night, the votes are in, Rob DeSantis has won, stop the counting now, all the mail-in ballots are hopelessly infected. So that tweet already is like written, just have to change a few words and it's going up. And, we were sitting there, the title of this thing from the person was, I won and my lawyers agree. So, I think it's going to be a heck of a thing. And, I think, we can all sort of prepare for it and tell people it's coming. But like so many things the president does, when he does it, and he will do it, it will be breathtaking. And I'm glad I'm not in either Abby or Amy's situation having to ad-lib my answer to that one. But yeah, it's coming.
Kim, one of the questions from the audience notes that Kim Wyman, the Secretary of State of Washington, who I believe is a Republican, says that an important job of an election administrator is to convince the loser that they lost. We don't have, unlike a lot of other countries, we don't have an electoral commission that officially announces the winner or loser. And one of the things that's interesting about this moment that we're in is so many people say, "Oh, what if?" And they don't say this about all candidates, but what if President Trump doesn't acknowledge his loss? Well, refuses to concede his loss. My reaction is always, it's really not up to him. It's not up to the candidate. It's up to the rest of us. What role should the news media play, and what role do others in society play? It's not entirely clear who's a respected by all sides figure anymore. But is there a role sooner or later? We're all talking about how to avoid premature declarations of a winner, but then at a certain point there will be. And how does that moment unfold?
That's such a good question. I don't have a great answer because I don't know what's going to actually happen. I think you're totally right that this is actually literally the thing that keeps me up at night is the inevitable declarations of infected ballots all across mail-in ballots all across the country. I actually think the big question is, what do congressional Republicans do if the case is that the president is the one who doesn't want to concede the outcome? Because I do think that in the past, you could rely on pressure from members of your own party, sort of push the person in the right direction. I mean, I remember even in 2016, Hillary Clinton got a call from Barack Obama, urging her to make the move that she eventually made well into the morning that night. And I don't know who that person is for a Donald Trump. I don't know if there's somebody that he would listen to. And I do think this is an open question. We don't know how the sort of the establishment of the Republican Party is going to react, and whether they will urge him to respect the data and the numbers, because this isn't going to be magic. It's going to be how many ballots are there and that are uncounted, and is there a reasonable expectation that they can change the result of the election? So, from our perspective in the media, I think we really just have to kind of stick with the facts to the extent that we can and rely really on the numbers as much as we can, because, I do think there's so much unknown, but we will have some semblance of a sense of what the universe is in terms of the number of votes. That'll get us maybe halfway there in terms of whether we know the outcome can be changed in one party's favor or another. And I think we just have to really push back as much as possible. And there are going to be a lot of isolated claims of wrongdoing on both sides of this. We saw this in Georgia. I remember on Georgia's primary day, I was getting tons and tons of emails and text messages from people in Georgia complaining about all kinds of aspects of the process. And we had to really meticulously go through all of those claims and try to understand what is the scope of this problem. And I think that is going to have to be done all over the country all night long, and probably even beyond that, to really figure out, do we have real systemic problems that might affect the outcome, or do we just have isolated incidents that are relatively minor in scope that are not going to affect the outcome?
And I have a question for you on that, because we get asked, we see these things as they unfold, and we look at them, and sometimes we think, oh, this is pretty bad, and sometimes we think, actually, this is just exaggerated and a stray thing here, a stray thing there. How can nonpartisan groups like the Brennan Center, and there are others, be helpful to the media in real time on that very challenge of figuring out what's really going on?
what I find to be very helpful is from outside groups, whether they're partisan or not, is just simply cataloging things. Because I think if we can establish that it's happening in more places than not, we can that gives us a huge sense of scope. Because, you know, if it's happening in densely populated urban areas, you know, we're talking about more and more votes. If it's happening in you know, sparsely populated places where there are not very many votes, it gives us a sense of scope. And you know, in the Georgia example, there were groups sort of giving us literally addresses of precincts where they were determined there were problems, and we could call and send people there and try to kind of to map out what is happening. And just knowing what the numbers are in terms of problems and knowing where they are located geographically will help journalists quite a lot, because that work can be done behind the scenes to figure out where there are problems and even take those questions to election officials who are also receiving, you know, inquiries and problems from their precincts as well.
And I think historical context, Michael, is helpful. You know, one of the things that we do in election land, and we do try to gather these things in a real-time basis and get them out there. One of the people who works on this with us has been doing this for many, many years, and he will tell you, you know, oh yeah, that part of Phoenix, there are always lines there, you know, so the extent to which you're seeing something new or different is useful. And I would just point out, Abby, that in the case of Georgia, we got some of the same reports, but we had no problem because you could go to the Secretary of State of Georgia, who, wait a minute, was the other candidate. So that was a little tricky.
So here's another question from the audience for each of you, or any of you. In your view, what election stories currently are not getting enough coverage? And I suppose the alternative part of that would be what's getting too much coverage.
Okay, I'll just volunteer real quick. I think this is increasingly getting more coverage, but how ballots are disqualified is a huge problem. I mean, huge. Even if we're talking about 3 or 4% of ballots, I think election officials kind of in the past could sort of shrug that off, because in a smaller universe of ballots, it's not that big of a deal. In a very large universe of ballots, that is a big deal, especially in a presidential election. I think there needs to be a lot of scrutiny about the process of spoiling ballots, and, you know, whether these rules are fair and whether they disenfranchise people unnecessarily. And that's it's obviously being litigated, but it's also a story that the media can play a role in terms of explaining to people. Not just explaining to people how to prevent their ballots from being spoiled, but also explaining to people some of these rules that might exist that they might not even think of, that could spoil their ballots.
Interestingly, you know, some of that is signature mismatch or whatever, but a lot of that is just the ballots coming in too late to be counted under whatever the state's law is. And Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State of Michigan, has been begging the state legislature to change the rules to make it so that they can start counting earlier, and just do things in a common sense way. She's not gotten success there. And in this morning's New York Post, Betsy McCoy, who was the Republican lieutenant governor of New York, did a column urging Congress to pass legislation requiring that states be able to count ballots that come in before election day, by election day, so that you don't have some of these things that lead to a very high rate of vote by mail or absentee ballots being rejected. Very worrisome. A far greater real risk of that than of fraud. What about other stories, Amy or Steve, that you think either are covered not enough or maybe too much? Was the post office covered too much, as an example?
Well, I'll jump in on that. I have been a postal skeptic, and many of the people who work for me insist that it's not as much of a problem, and maybe so. I mean, you know, the problem with this president is, you know, he says things like there were too many COVID cases, I told him to stop testing, and then you go back and you look and you discover, well, he might have said it, but nobody actually did it. It was just a fun thing to say. So his sort of notion that we're going to screw up the post office and prevent the mail-in balloting, I think that's still a sort of undetermined for my taste. Although if you look at the mathematics of the number of ballots that have to move and the amount of mail that is actually moving every day, there may be less there than meets the eye. I think that's fair. I would remind people, again, going back to the olden days about spoiled ballots, if you look at how the Gore v. Bush thing ultimately was swung, I mean, it was a combination of a few hanging chads here and there. That's paper ballots where you couldn't determine what actually happened with them, for those who don't remember all that. And then crazily, because we do it this way in America, a ballot design in one part of Florida that made people who were voting for Gore accidentally cast their ballot for Ralph Nader. And so that swing of a few thousand votes from those two things made the one person president over the other in our system. And so we don't need 3 to 4%. If we get that kind of level of spoilage that Abby is suggesting, that's an astounding number of votes. That's easily enough to swing any battleground state you could think of. So anything we can do to avoid that seems like really an important thing.
To me, the big challenge, and look, I'm having this challenge as well as I'm talking to you from inside my house and not where we'd normally be, which is on the road or with candidates. The inability to actually be with people has been really hard in order to get like a good sense of what's going on the ground, right? I mean, half of the reporting that to me is fun is eavesdropping on people. I mean, I remember really specifically one year being with the Romney campaign and sort of sneaking in to one of these, not sneaking in, but I was in one of these events and listening to just eavesdropping on how people were talking about Romney and how people were talking about their senator. And, that's the sort of stuff that it's not just about color. It also gives you like a good grounding, right? This is what normal people are doing when we're not putting them on camera, when we're not sitting them in focus groups, when we're just, we're wandering through the farmer's market, or we're just, chit-chatting with people in their neighborhood. So it has felt like this incredibly disconnected campaign. And that has been really frustrating for me. And so we're relying much more now on, again, how people feel about the president, which is important. It's a very important barometer into how people vote. The president's approval rating has always traditionally been a good measure of the kind of support we expect him to get. But it's also making us so much more reliant on polling data, which I'm not saying that it is incorrect. It's just that it's missing the human element of all of this. And it's also missing everything that we just discussed right now, which is nobody really knows who's turning out. What kind of, I agree with you, Michael, that we're going to see a record turnout, but, so what's a likely voter in that scenario? And what does happen if even, 20,000 absentee ballots are discarded because they've been spoiled or they came in too late? That is, that's the worrisome and frustrating piece, honestly, for me.
Thinking even of 2016, just going to suburban areas in Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia, and seeing the profusion of lawn signs for Trump was a real, just a very quick sign that something was a little different from what the polls were suggesting. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance of, gee, there's a lot of lawn signs. How odd that is, given that Hillary Clinton's going to win. But in fact, being out there makes a big difference. We love Room Rater, but it's not a substitute. Last question for each of you.
Could I just quickly add, I also think, to Amy's point about what we don't know about who is a likely voter, one thing that I'm hoping to look into before the election is the extent to which we don't know who is voting, who maybe would not have voted before, who might choose to vote now, that maybe mail-in voting is a little bit more convenient for them. It's easier for them to get their heads around. I think it changes potentially the electorate in ways that we can't really fully understand right now because we don't have enough data to understand it.
And as we're wrapping up, Steve, what are you planning on focusing on that we haven't focused on enough between now and Election Day?
Well, I just had a conversation. I mean, you always feel you don't know what you don't know. And I think the thing we didn't know in 2016 was the extent and breadth and depth of the online deception campaign. And we are trying to come up with some ways to get at that. I do think that in many ways in 2016, we, the media, missed some of the biggest stories because they were unfolding in ways and in places that were hard to measure. There is, despite what Facebook is committed to, no real repository of Facebook advertising. You don't really know, which sock puppets and so on are out there from which countries, ginning up God knows what. So if in the next 60 days we're going to try to use some methods to get at that, but I'm not confident. I'm afraid that just as in 2016, it will take well into 21 before we really fully understood what happened in 2020. So it could be a long election coverage period.
And Amy, anything you're especially thinking about? We haven't even talked about the Senate or House or local races between now and Election Day.
Right. I mean, remember the two things people are waiting to hear from Wolf Blitzer are who's the next president is and who has control of Congress. And we know a couple of things about the control of Congress. First, that in a state like Maine, for example, again, forget everything else we know about absentee ballots and how long it's going to take to count. They have a top two, not a top two, ranked choice voting in Maine, which means that there's a possibility that counting for that is also going to go on longer than just election night. So we won't know potentially the answer to who won the Maine Senate race, which is critical in determining who has control. Georgia, they also have runoffs. If you don't hit 50% of the vote, both of those would go either to December and one in January. And so, for those of us who spend all year waiting for election night, that's what I do. It's the most exciting night of the year for me. It is somewhat unsatisfying to think, we could leave without knowing the answer to the two biggest questions we've been studying for, the last 2 years. But I think we have to be realistic about that possibility too.
And Abby, you get the last word.
Well, I think that one of the things that we got to focus on is, are election officials doing enough to make this work? Is USPS doing enough? Maybe there's not some grand conspiracy, but there are some basic things. I mean, I may be the youngest person on this panel. There are some basic things that I have been appalled to find that we don't do as a country. I think the sort of sporadic nature of ballot tracking is very troublesome. I think that there are some real questions about whether, the process by which they are able to process many ballots is fast enough, and maybe they're not investing in these what they call high throughput ballot counters that they need in order to do that. These are sort of money problems and technological problems that actually can be resolved. And I do think that that light needs to be shed on them. Otherwise, there's going to be no incentive for people to really solve them. And if we do that, I think we might have a better shot at having a more smooth election night. And I think the American people deserve a smooth election night. I don't think we need to sort of accept that this is going to be a disaster, because it really doesn't have to be a disaster. These problems can definitely be solved.
Thank you so much. And we all hope that, to use the year 2000 metaphor, that this is Y2K and not the Florida recount that we're looking at. First of all, thank you for a wonderful conversation to Stephen Engelberg, to Abby Phillip, and to Amy Walter. Thank you from the Brennan Center to our partners in producing this event, ProPublica, NYU's Brademas Center, and NYU Votes. A few notes from the Brennan Center, ways to all of you can help bolster our democracy before we're done. If you have not already, we urge you, please, to go complete your census form. You can do it online at my2020census.gov. It's, of course, extraordinarily quick and confidential. And important, among other things, in determining what the lines are going to be in redistricting and political power going forward. If you can sign up to vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, please do so. Tell your friends and family and check on your status now. Find out if you're registered, find out what the rules are, and whatever you do, try to do it early. If you don't have the ability, we would say, to vote by mail or to vote early, please call your members of Congress and your legislators and let them know that you would like that going forward. I am Michael Waldman. I'm the president of the Brennan Center. And on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for being a part of this, and have a good day.